Everything is wonderful in the village. Fresh air, forest, and a river just a stone's throw from the house. What sounds are familiar to village life? The cry of a rooster, the mooing of a cow, the roar of a tractor engine, the conversations of old people on a bench. Everyone who has been to the village can recall his or her associations with this atmospheric place. But on this day, the usual routine was interrupted by the signal of an ambulance. The only one who shouted louder than it was Ellie, who had called it for herself. "Steve, come with me, I'm scared," Ellie's wife asked. "Where am I going to put my household?" the husband replied with his hands. "I won't have time to close all the locks before I drive the cattle in. Go without me. I'll be right here as soon as I'm free." "What's there to drive?" Ellie resented me. 3 cows, 2 goats. Your wife's having a miscarriage. Are you still thinking about your unprofitable business? The doctors have already hinted to Ellie that there's no time to argue with her husband. It's a matter of minutes. She's bleeding pretty badly. While Steve hesitated to answer. The car doors had already slammed shut and Ellie was being taken into town. Steve was already imagining how badly his wife would kick him when she got home, but he really couldn't put his business on hold. In fact, he thought there was nothing serious going on with his wife. She just yelled too much and got nervous. That's why the pregnancy was hard. All the way the woman wailed and cried. How could it be? Her husband left her at such a difficult moment. Steve's farm, and so was the main cause of quarrels, scandals in this family. Even Ellie's pregnancy was hard, because she was constantly on her nerves. Just the day before, she had asked Steve to sell the unprofitable farm and go to the city. He had a degree in welding. There was a shortage of such specialists in town. They would live well, but the man did not want to part with his farm. He was hooked on country life. How many times Ellie had told him that there was no proper hospital in the village. The school was in the neighboring village only. They had never heard of kindergartens. They would be much more comfortable in the city. But the man was relentless. He was not going to change his village life for a life in a stone jungle. Ellie came out of the study. She wasn't wearing her face. She pulled out her cell phone and called Steve. "We're not going to have Mike," she said sadly. "We didn't have time." Steve sighed heavily and audibly, but didn't answer. Ellie heard her husband sniffling, so he didn't want to talk, lest she realize he was crying. "Will you come and get me?" she asked. "I'm being discharged tomorrow." "Ellie, I can't tell you yet. I have so much to do. Some people from the city are coming to visit. They have a proposition for me," Steve replied. He already knew what kind of reaction was coming. Ellie held back at first. She didn't want to make a scene in the middle of the hospital, but she was shaking with anger. In addition to the grief she had experienced, she also felt abandoned, unwanted. How Steve could not realize that his support was vital to her now. But Ellie couldn't speak directly and gently. She didn't know how to ask. The woman spoke only in the language of aggression and demands, afraid to show herself weak and defenseless. That's why this time she made another scandal. Instead of a calm conversation. "Are you suggesting that I take the bus?" she asked discreetly, though she was beginning to boil. With every word, the tension in her voice rose. "After what had happened to me, I'd be stuck in a stuffy bus. Ellie, maybe this is my chance." Her husband answered her, and there was a kind of pleading in his voice. He was counting on his wife's understanding. "What if it works out? How will we live? What can the city offer you?" Ellie started to get even more agitated. "Who needs your business? I've already lost a child because of you and you keep making me nervous." "Don't say that. You don't believe in me? That's why I can't do anything for myself." Steve answered her a little resentfully. Ellie hung up the phone. She realized that this conversation was useless. It would only make her more nervous, but she wouldn't get anything from her husband. Most of all, she was angry that Steve really didn't realize that his farm would never be a success. Who needs milk and eggs in the country? Everyone has plenty of those things, and for the city, his turnover is small. Businessmen will not cooperate with him. The woman hoped that Steve would come to his senses and realize that she couldn't take the bus. She believed that her spouse would choose her over his business. The next morning she called Steve immediately. All she had to do was open her eyes. How much she hoped the man had realized his mistake. "Can't make it, Ellie," Steve answered her guiltily. "The car won't start." "Why are you lying to me?" The woman was angry. Yesterday it started, today it didn't. Tell me you don't care about me. No, I was thinking about you all night last night. Of course I had to meet you. But technology failed me. Repentant and honest, Steve confessed. He wasn't lying. His car did fail to start. But the man wasn't too upset about it. He was afraid to miss the meetings with the city businessmen who were to arrive that day. Only the time hadn't been given. Ellie hung up the phone to avoid wasting energy on idle talk and swearing. It seemed to her that her husband didn't even realize what had happened to her. It was as if he wasn't sad that the baby had died. He didn't realize what a heartache it was for her. If Steve said he couldn't come, there was no point in hoping for him. The woman covered her head with a blanket and cried bitterly, so that the neighbors in the room did not see her tears. But everyone had already guessed everything. "Why do you need such a husband?" one of the girls lying with Ellie said. "In fact," agreed the second neighbor, "if you had given birth, he would also send you on the bus with the baby." "You girls don't say anything," Ellie replied from under the blanket. "I'm exhausted. Where am I going to leave him? If I leave, it's a disgrace for the whole village." "Stay in town and let him stay there with his cows," recommended the first neighbor. Ellie didn't answer anything. She had thought about divorce many times, but she had nowhere to go. It was true that divorce was not very common in the village. Everyone was used to living with what God sent. Half of the people Ellie knew were married either to bums who drank or to men who went away for months at a time to work. Everyone was used to making do with what they had. She reassured herself that at least Steve didn't drink and didn't do nothing. Even if the farm was unprofitable, at least her husband was busy. And he was on fire. Ellie even supported him at first. But then she ran out of energy. If Steve had listened to her, sold everything before he moved to the city, they'd have a good life. But where would she go without him? Ellie decided not to go straight to the train station. She wasn't in town much. She only came for errands to the hospital or to store for appliances. She just wanted to walk around the center, to see how people lived. Of course, she wasn't dressed very presentably, but who knows who she was. Her state of mind was so depressed that it didn't matter what she looked like. Ellie called a cab and asked to be taken to the main street, where all the citizens spent their time. The woman's eyes widened at the variety of stores and restaurants. She wasn't used to so many people. Everyone was either rushing around or just strolling leisurely. People were beautifully dressed, girls with hair and makeup. Ellie looked like a white crow among the crowd, but she wasn't embarrassed at all. No one paid any attention to her. The woman imagined that she too, in a dress or a suit, was walking along these streets, going to a cafe, and then to a boutique for a new handbag. The only thing she didn't like was the noise. From all sides came either snippets of other people's conversations, or car horns, or music from cafes and stores. It seemed unusual, but she could get used to it. Suddenly, Ellie saw a gorgeous dress in a store window. She couldn't help but stop and hold her gaze on it. The woman had seen such outfits only in movies on some rich women. "Do you like it?" suddenly a man asked her. Ellie even jumped from fright and surprise. She looked at the stranger who had spoken to her, and at first she didn't believe that he could have been addressing her. Ellie turned back to see if there was any pretty girl behind her that the man might have spoken to. When she was sure she was alone outside the store, she decided to answer. "I can only dream of such a thing. I don't have the face for this kind of outfit," she said, embarrassed. Ellie was lying. She was a prominent woman, quite beautiful. If it weren't for her poor clothes, she would be unrecognizable as a villager. "Don't say you look so chic," the man answered her. "Look at all these beauties around you. What is left of their beauty if you wash off the makeup and take off the branded clothes? Just emptiness. And you are beautiful without all that glamour." Ellie blushed. She had never received such nice and beautiful compliments. The man introduced himself as Max and extended his hand. She said her name too and wanted to shake his hand, but the new acquaintance took her hand and kissed it. Ellie blushed even more. In the village, she would have been called a cheater for this action. It was a good thing none of the neighbors could see it and would never know about it. "Do you want me to buy you this dress and you will see that you are not far from the local beauties?" Max offered. "Really?" I was a little amazed, even a little scared of Ellie. "I don't have anywhere to wear this. It's probably worth as much as my house in the country. It's just a small thing to me. I just want to cheer you up." "You look depressed," Max said. Ellie lowered her eyes and confirmed that she was in a sad mood. Max suggested that she go to a restaurant. He wanted to find out what could have saddened this beautiful woman. If necessary, he was ready to help. This time Ellie decided to agree for some reason. She didn't realize how she'd answered. She was on her way to the nearest restaurant with her new acquaintance. When they went inside, Ellie realized how inappropriate she looked in this place. If on the street no one paid attention to her, then now the eyes of all the staff and visitors were fixed only on her. The woman even blushed and wanted to leave. "We will go to the VIP table where no one can embarrass you," Max said when he noticed the change in Ellie's mood. "Don't pay attention to these people. They are just stupid, not used to the sight of ordinary people." Ellie told Max how she had come to be in the city, and what she liked most about it. The man had asked her about it. Max was interested in her life. He also constantly asked if she liked this or that dish. Steve usually only talked about himself and his business, so it was unusual and pleasant to receive attention. While the new acquaintances were talking, an assistant approached Max and handed him a package. Ellie immediately recognized the writing on it. It had the name of the store where she liked the dress. She dared to assume that Max had asked his subordinate to buy her the dress, but the thought seemed too bold. Ellie hurriedly pushed it away from her. What was her surprise when the man handed her a package and told her it was a gift for her. "I can't accept such an expensive gift," replied Ellie, who was actually quite eager to receive it. But she was afraid that after that she would owe something. "I just want to cheer myself up. It doesn't mean anything," Max answered and put the bag next to Ellie. Now the woman shrank back. She didn't know how to behave. She looked at her watch and said she had to go to the station. The bus was leaving in an hour. "Let me give you a ride home," Max suggested. "It would be much more comfortable than a stuffy bus." "Thanks for the offer, but I'll pass," Ellie replied. "I don't know how I'm going to explain to my husband that I came back with a man, and with such an expensive gift. You don't want to attract so much attention, and your car will definitely be noticed in our village." Ellie was not only afraid that rumors of her infidelity would spread among the neighbors. She was just scared to get into a car with a stranger, and such a pushy one at that. Something about the rich man scared her. Max offered to drive her to the train station, but Ellie refused again. The man guessed from her look that he had gone too far with the signs of attention, and the woman was now wary of him. She was understandable, so Max said he'd call a cab. "So you'll feel safe?" he asked Ellie. "Yes, that will be quite enough," she replied politely. All the way there, Ellie thought of ways to explain to herself how she had gotten such an expensive dress. She even ripped off the label so he wouldn't know how much it cost. The woman berated herself for accepting this gift. She wouldn't even have anywhere to wear this beauty. On the other hand, she convinced herself that she simply deserved such a dress. And it wouldn't hurt Steve to know that his wife was still attracting interest from the opposite sex, especially with men like Max. In a way, she even wanted to make her husband jealous. She had him completely relaxed. When the bus pulled up to the stop, Ellie saw her husband at once. Did he really have the sense to meet her here? "You took so long," Steve said as he helped her off the bus. "It's been a long time since I've been discharged." The man noticed the bag in Ellie's hands, but he didn't ask anything yet. Ellie took notice, lifted her nose haughtily and flipped her hair back. She was still resentful of Steve for not picking her up in town. Decided to take a walk. With a little pathos, she replied, "I can't wait for you to take me into town." "You probably need some peace and you're taking a walk," her husband replied, without any anger. On the contrary, in his voice he felt care. "I see you've got some new clothes. Don't be silly. We'll never be able to afford such a dress." Ellie answered him with the same feigned pathos. "It's an expensive designer dress. I won it in a raffle." Steve was surprised that his wife, after the miscarriage, had time to participate in contests. It's amazing where that woman got her energy. After such a difficult moral event, she still had the strength to go for a walk, and on scandals, and on entertainment. Steve realized that he was much weaker morally than his spouse. Ellie lied that she went to the cafe for lunch and became the 1,000th customer. That's what she got the dress for. Steve did not question the logic of such a gift from the cafe. He believed his wife. She couldn't really buy it if it was so expensive. That someone else could have given her such a gift, Steve didn't even think about it. It was easier to believe that the cafe owner had accidentally guessed the size. As Ellie rested after the road, she noticed that her spouse had something to say to her. Steve always began to behave very strangely if he realized that he needed to start a conversation, the subject of which Ellie would be uncomfortable. He'd start doing things he wasn't used to doing. He offered to do the dishes, walked in circles around the room, constantly went out into the yard in search of something to do. By the way, there's always something to do in the village. But if Steve was in such a nervous state, he could not find any tasks for himself. "Tell me what's happened again." I couldn't stand it any longer and put the unbeaten glass of tea on the table. "I'm having a little trouble on the farm," Steve began to say uncertainly. Ellie noted that it was not surprising since her husband was always in trouble. She asked him to get to the point because her patience was wearing thin. "I need money. I should buy a pig or a calf." Steve was pacing from side to side even more than before. "I thought we should sell your dress since it's so expensive you have nowhere to wear it in the village anyway. And when I'm doing well, I'll buy one just like it, or even better." If Ellie hadn't been sitting on the chair, she would have fallen off her feet. She was used to all kinds of offers from her husband, but this was too much. "Maybe I should sell your farm and move into town. Then I'd have an excuse to wear a dress," Ellie began to say. And with each new word, her intonation increased and became more and more irritated. "Until you get on your feet and earn money for a dress, I won't need it, unless you bury me in it." Ellie pounded her hands on the table, got up and left the house. She wanted to go somewhere far away from the house, so as not to continue arguing with her husband. Ellie walked to the river. The sight of water calmed her, but not this time. The dark smoothness of the river surface, the sunny, which was already approaching the horizon, made her homesick. "Why on earth did I go on this walk?" said Ellie, but very quietly. "Why did I meet Max? I was living my life in peace. I thought all men were like Steve. Turns out they're not. There are men who can give gifts, listen, and pity. I can't go on living like I used to. I can't." Ellie cried bitterly. She felt resentful that someone in this life was lucky enough to get married, live in the city, and go to restaurants. Her reality was a backwoods village and a loser husband. She remembered herself as a little girl, as she dreamed of having a family. Ever since she was a child, Ellie had envisioned herself as a mom of many children, and in the end she couldn't even bear one child. The woman cried bitterly. "I was tired of being strong," she said. "Tired of this hopelessness. Steve will never succeed and I'm just wasting my time with him." All her pain, her fatigue, Ellie left on the shore. Her state of mind was constantly changing. She was angry or sad or dreaming. The woman was already confused about her own feelings. When Ellie returned home, Steve had already gone to bed. The farmer has to get up early, so he went to bed at a rather early time. Of course, Ellie knew about her husband's peculiarity. She herself was used to such early rising and going to bed, but this time, her adherence to her husband's habits infuriated her. She grabbed a towel and started hitting Steve. "So his wife's gone off to the wrong place. She's been gone for hours, and he's on the sidelines." Ellie screamed, "What if I'm drowning myself? Maybe something happened to me. And you went to sleep." "Stop it, please," asked the frightened man and covered his face with his hands. "I know you won't do anything to yourself. You love yourself too much." Ellie froze. She realized that her husband didn't care at all. He didn't care about her. He wasn't jealous. But Steve didn't treat his spouse because he didn't care. It's just that he trusted his wife and could not even think that she was capable of any rash act. "Get off the bed." "I don't want to share a bed with you," Ellie said harshly. "You'll sleep on the floor, on the mat." Steve obeyed his wife's wishes without question. He understood that her hormones were raging. Besides, Ellie had been through a lot of stress, so it was better to do what she wanted. The man even scolded himself a little for not going after her. But it was too late for regrets now. The next day, Ellie woke up even earlier than her husband. She didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk to Steve. She wanted to excite her husband a little, to let him know that she would not be stuck to him forever, and that it would be easy to lose her. "If you must know," Ellie said smugly after Steve had washed up and sat down to breakfast, "I didn't win that dress. It was given to me by a wealthy man because he liked me. My cows started giving cheese instead of milk." Her husband laughed at her. "And the most expensive one will be golden soon." It was clear from the look on Ellie's face that Steve should have kept silent. It wasn't that she was angry again. Rather, there was disappointment in her eyes. "So you think no one can look at me? You don't think I'm a woman at all?" Ellie asked with sincere sadness. All her arrogance evaporated. "Why do you have a woman of prominence, the most beautiful in the village?" Steve tried to cheer up his wife. "I just do not believe that someone can make such gifts for nothing, especially city people. They don't have souls. They're as callous as stone." Ellie didn't say anything. She thought for a while and said she had to go back to town in a week. After the miscarriage, she had to get a checkup. "Will you drive me or do I have to take the bus again?" she asked, no longer hoping for a positive answer. "I'll do everything I can to be free by this day," Steve answered her. "Or they'll steal you away." The man said the last phrase with an obvious sneer. That finally convinced Ellie that her husband was not worried about it at all. Why so much self-confidence in the usually farmer's loser? All week, Ellie and Steve had barely spoken to each other. Ellie just didn't want to because every time they talked, she ended up disappointed. And Steve was afraid to say the wrong thing so as not to make his wife angry or upset. Only one event forced them to talk seriously. Toward the end of the week, an expensive car pulled up to the house. It was obviously someone from out of town, and the license plates were fake. Ellie was scared at first. She thought it was Max. He'd somehow found out her address and had come to pick her up from her husband. Even though she was worried, she had a little hope in her heart that it was. But another man got out of the car, and he came to his own place. It was the same city businessman that Steve hadn't gone to meet his wife for, but the last time they'd met, they hadn't. Steve went out to visit, satisfied. He was expecting to hear a proposal that would change his life forever. On the one hand, the businessman said something similar, but on the other hand, it was not the change the farmer dreamed of. The businessman wanted to build a recreation center in the village. He liked the air and nature here, and there was a river. The only thing standing in his way was Steve's farm. He needed the exact area where it was located. The man offered a huge sum of money to buy out Steve's life's work. When Ellie heard the offer, she even sat down on the bench, though she suspected what her husband would say. And her suspicions were correct. Steve flatly refused to sell the farm, no matter how the businessman did not increase the amount and did not try to persuade him. It was pointless. "My offer always stands," the millionaire said in parting. "So here's my number if you can think of it. I'll come back to you myself." Steve took the card but threw it away as soon as the man left. "What a fool," Ellie commented on her husband's decision, and went back inside. "You'll find out that you were wrong all along," confidently said the man, to himself. "I'll prove it." Steve managed to find time to fix the car and drive into town with his wife. Ellie hoped that her husband would enjoy the atmosphere of the city. She planned to take him for a walk to see the streets and restaurants. Steve agreed to the proposal, but only to avoid upsetting his wife. He didn't like the city at all. "Look how beautiful it is," Ellie exclaimed. "I don't see anything beautiful without any negativity," her husband replied. "It's all pretty, but it has no soul. It's dusty, noisy, and gray. Is that how I can describe your city? Let's go home. I'm getting a headache from all the talking and honking and stuffiness." "All right." His saddened wife answered him. "But I'm stopping by this restaurant, really don't need the ladies' room." Steve didn't mind. He sat down on a bench in front of the establishment and took out a pack of cigarettes. As soon as Ellie entered the restaurant, she was greeted by a young girl and asked what table she had reserved and for what time. "Young lady, I just need to use the restroom," Ellie answered her in a pitiful voice. In response, she received a surprised look on her face. It was the first time she had ever seen such a thing. "Excuse me, but you can go to the diner around the corner." She didn't sound as polite as before. "Only visitors are allowed to use our restrooms." Ellie was upset. She didn't want to go to the diner, but she had to. She wasn't going to grovel and beg to be let in. The woman turned to leave, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "This is a beautiful woman with me," Max said with some pride. But she tried to compose the girl, but Max interrupted her and replied that he did not care who and what said. "The woman is with me, so you have to let her in. Otherwise you'll lose a client in my face." Ellie was let in, and Max politely informed her that she could and was on her way to where she was so eager to go. Ellie had never felt so humiliated in her life. She was just incredibly embarrassed. But she decided that going would be even worse, and she didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk to Max again. It took Ellie a long time to decide to leave the ladies' room. She washed her hands and face several times, thinking about the shameful encounter that had happened between them. Ellie thought about how she could get out of the situation nicely, and realized that the longer she was in the bathroom, the worse it would get. What would they think? The woman gathered her thoughts and finally stepped out. After all, Max might have already left or never met her again. But the man stood in the same place. He hadn't gone anywhere, but was deliberately waiting for Ellie to return. Her heart rolled frantically. Now she felt as stupid as possible. "I've been thinking about you all the days since we met and berating myself for not asking for your phone number," Max said, completely oblivious to how much time she'd spent there. Ellie was so taken aback by the question that she immediately dictated the phone number. She had never imagined that it would lead to any kind of communication. Only later the woman thought that it was probably not quite right with her husband alive. "You took a long time," Steve said when Ellie came out. "Did you enter some contest again?" "No, a man wanted to meet me," Ellie replied seriously. She wanted to test her husband's reaction again. "Yeah, and I'm out here trying to fight off a bunch of models. Let's go home. The noise and dust are giving me a headache," Steve joked back. Ellie sighed heavily. To contain her rage, she was insulted that her husband once again didn't believe in the possibility that she might pique someone's interest. While they were driving home, though, Max had texted her that he missed her already. Involuntarily, the woman smiled and then deleted the message and put her phone away. Steve did not even notice how his spouse's mood had changed. "Are they sending advertisements again?" he asked when he heard the notification sound. "No, it reminds him to deposit money," Ellie answered him. Steve asked her to remind him to go to the post office and put money on her phone. "Didn't you like the city at all? Didn't you have any desire to move?" Ellie asked hopefully. "No, I am even more convinced that we are very lucky to live in the countryside." "Quiet, fresh, and peaceful," Steve told her. "Hopelessness and boredom. That's life in your village." Elle objected to her husband's words. It had been a month since Ellie had last been in town and had given her phone number to Max. All this time she had been corresponding with the millionaire, and he even began to declare his love to her and asked her to leave her husband and go to him. At first, Ellie thought about stopping all this, but each time she could not help but respond to the man's messages. Meanwhile, with Steve, the relationship was getting worse and worse. Steve kept getting visits from a businessman from the city. He visited the farmer 2 or 3 times a week, but Steve still refused the money and said he wouldn't sell the farm. "Don't be surprised if something bad happens to your farm." The businessman couldn't stand it at the last meeting and decided to scare Steve. But the man said he wasn't afraid of anything. Ellie clutched her head. She begged her husband to come to his senses. If he was already receiving threats, it was better to accept what was being offered. Your farm would be lost and you wouldn't even get anything out of it. Ellie tried to talk some sense into Steve. "They won't do anything. They're just scaring you." Waving his hand, the man replied, "We have a big village. They'll find another place. Sooner or later they'll give up." But Ellie was not convinced by these words. If the businessman was so attached to this territory, he wanted it. He could have found another plot long ago and started construction. The woman decided to ask her lover to help. She wrote to Max, sent pictures of the businessman. Ellie thought that since she and Max were both millionaires from the same city, they probably knew each other. "I'm sorry, this is a very serious man," Max replied. "I can't help you. Make up your mind to move in with me already. From the looks of it, your husband is about to lose everything." Ellie realized that Steve really wouldn't change his mind. She decided to leave him, but not right away. First, she had to prepare herself mentally to sleep with the idea. During the night, Steve and Ellie were awakened by the screaming of a neighbor's man. "Your farm's on fire! Go put it out! By the time you wait for the firemen, the fire will have spread to the houses," the man shouted. Steve and Ellie grabbed buckets and ran to the farm. They managed to stop the fire from spreading, and then the firemen arrived. It took until morning to put out Steve's life's work, and he sat on the ground holding his head and sobbing. How could it be? How? Unfortunately, it was too late to detect the start of the fire, and all the cattle suffocated almost immediately. Steve sobbed, pounding the ground, throwing his hands in the air and asking heaven why and for what. He set the fire. "I'll prove it. Steve's been talking since this morning. Didn't the fireman tell you the wiring was shorted?" Ellie answered him. "I'm not surprised at all. The place has been a wreck for a long time." "No. First he came to me threatening me, and that same night there was a fire. Are you saying it's a coincidence?" Steve wouldn't let it go. "I'm saying it's a sign. You've done everything you can here, but you see it's not working," Ellie said. "Let's sell the house and move to the city. There's nothing to keep us here anymore." "I'm not going," Steve shouted and pounded his fist on the table. Allie was frightened. She had never seen her husband so angry before. "I'm going to rebuild everything. I'm going to start from scratch. They can't break me. This lot is mine by right. In that case, I must tell you that I'm leaving." Ellie answered him with sadness in her voice. "I've given you one last chance, but you don't want to waste any more time in this remote village. If it didn't work out the first time, there's no point in going the second or third time." Steve didn't even believe his wife at first. He did not want to admit the truth, and when she packed her bags, he thought that his wife just wanted to push him. But although he's depressed, he's not broken. Steve is not going to go to the city and knew for sure that his decision was the right one. Suddenly a car pulled up to the house. Steve stepped outside. He thought it was a businessman coming to take the farm away, but it was a different car, and a different man got out of it. Ellie jumped out with a suitcase in her hand, ran up to the man and hugged him tightly. Only now did it dawn on Steve that she wasn't deceiving him, that this wasn't her feminine game. Ellie really did have a rich lover. Ellie got into the car and kept her eyes on her spouse until the last moment. There was no emotion on his face. The recent events had simply devastated him morally. "Rats are the first to flee from a sinking ship," Steve said as the car disappeared over the horizon. Allie had been living at Max's house for a month. She started to live a different life, interesting, full of events, without saving money, including on herself. Ellie bought herself a lot of new and beautiful clothes, had her hair done, went to a beautician. In a word, a villager. It became difficult to recognize her. But not all of Ellie's expectations of life with a millionaire coincided with reality. The man disappeared very often. He was rarely at home. Max explained it by the fact that he has constant meetings, work. But what confused Ellie was that he returned with the smell of booze, and sometimes he smelled the scent of women's perfume. "It's part of my life too," Max explained. "The partners are not always men, and sometimes negotiations have to be informal. Contracts are signed faster with a glass of cognac." Ellie was sympathetic to everything. So far, Max had given no particular reason not to trust him, although sometimes it seemed to the woman that he was interested in her only as a trophy. And when Max got what he wanted, the interest disappeared. But soon Ellie was in for a treat. Max decided to introduce her to his friends. It was one of his friends' birthday. Only this holiday did not bring any joy to Ellie. She became even more worried because she saw what kind of wives Max's friends had. Not to say that they were much prettier than Ellie, but they were so groomed, unnatural, as if from a picture. There were plenty of loose girls at the gala, too. None of them were shy about approaching Max to openly flirt with him, even in front of Ellie. Some of the girls kissed him on the cheek when greeting him. Some of them hugged him. There were girls circling around the man all the time. The presence of Ellie next to him didn't embarrass anyone. How do girls behave around him when he's alone? Ellie grimaced to herself. But what annoyed her even more was that Max was also happy to respond to the flirting by kissing and hugging her. The day after that party, Ellie decided to bring up the issue of Max's behavior with women in her absence. She wondered for a long time if she even had the right to make a complaint. After all, so far Ellie had been living solely off Max. But on the other hand, she had left her husband for him, left her whole past life behind. After all, they live together and are a couple. Of course she has the right to be jealous and say she doesn't like the excessive attention to her man. "I'm so guilty of making you worry," Max answered in a naive voice after listening to the claims of his beloved. By the way, Ellie didn't notice this insincerity. She decided that Max was being honest with her. "Let's get married," Max suddenly suggested. "Let's become husband and wife." Ellie's eyes widened. She clarified if she had correctly realized that the man had just proposed to her. "Yes, divorce your husband. And you and I will get a divorce the very next day," Max exclaimed excitedly. He was so excited about the idea, he picked Ellie up in his arms and carried her around the room. Ellie caught the positivity from him. She was smiling and jumping with happiness too. That same day, she went to the registry office to file for divorce. To Steve, the woman decided not to call. She simply wrote a message saying that she had filed for divorce. "It's up to you," Steve replied. There was no further response from him. He wasn't even going to show up for the trial. They had no children, they both agreed. So there were no complications with the divorce. A month later, Ellie herself took the divorce petition and mailed a copy to the village. "So that was it," Steve said quietly, looking at the certificate of divorce he took out of the envelope. "Our story is over. It wasn't the way we'd imagined it." Steve took out a bottle of vodka from the refrigerator, which was just waiting for this day. In general, the man did not drink, but on this day he wanted to forget. He went to his neighbor and friend John. He knew that one day they would have this sad feast, but Steve was a guest only at first. After a couple of shots of tea, his mood lifted. "And she still knows who she's lost," confidently exclaimed he. "She'll come running back. And you will not accept?" His comrade encouraged him. "Will you jump back to town?" "No, I will, John," Steve answered sadly. "I don't want any other woman. I'll do anything just to prove her wrong. I'm going to buy an even better car than that lover of hers." "I'd find another woman if I were you," John said. "But it's up to you. Let's drink to make it work. And it will," Steve said with complete confidence. There was no doubt this time. It had been almost a year since Max and Ellie had been married. In vain the woman hoped that after the wedding her spouse would change. Things only got worse every month. Not only was Max coming home late at night with lipstick on his shirt, he started lashing out at Ellie. If she had the nerve to ask him any questions. "None of your business," he yelled at his wife. "You're just a kept woman in this house." Indeed, Ellie never had anything of her own. Max wouldn't let her go out to work, wouldn't open a business for her, even though she asked him to. Ellie didn't understand how she could have been so wrong about the man in the first place. The woman thought she had trapped herself. There was no getting away from Max as easily as there was from Steve. Her new husband was terribly possessive, and he had plenty of opportunities to find or harm a runaway spouse. Ellie didn't understand how she should live, whether to endure cheating and humiliation for money or to leave everything and run away, so that Max would never find her. Once again, it was past midnight, and Max wasn't home. Ellie poured herself a glass of whiskey and stayed in the kitchen. She didn't want to miss the moment her husband came home. It was after 2 a.m. and he was still gone. Suddenly Mary, the housekeeper, entered the kitchen. She frightened Ellie because she thought all the servants were asleep. "We can't go to bed until Max comes," the housekeeper answered her. "What if he wants to eat or needs something cleaned up? Anyway, we'll wait till the last minute. What a nightmare. He's out every night. And all this time you don't sleep?" Ellie was surprised. "No, we take turns, of course," Mary told her. "The guards, for example. They're always awake because they're monitoring the security cameras. But they have a schedule. It's not always the same person. They might let me know that Max is coming up. Then I wake everybody up. But in case a guard does take a nap, someone else is sure to be awake. Now, for example, it's my turn. Before that, the cook was awake. It's like some kind of bullying. I'm sure other houses don't have that kind of routine," Ellie pitied the maid. Mary told her that indeed other employers did not have such conditions, and she talked to staff from neighboring houses. Some of them had such conditions, but their owners didn't go out every night. It might have happened once every few months, for example. Did I really mess Max up like that? Ellie was worried. Now he doesn't even want to be home. No, he's always been like that. Like he was with his first wife, Mary told her, and then she got scared and stopped talking. But Ellie couldn't leave her alone. He was already married, she marveled. He told me I was his first love. Why did they divorce? Tell me, don't be afraid. I'll pretend I don't know. Mary refused to talk about her boss's past for a long time. She was about to write a letter of resignation, because she suspected that was what Max would force her to do if he found out that she had told Ellie about her first marriage. Mary, I torture myself every day for ruining such a wonderful man. Ellie pleaded. I thought Max was so different before the marriage. How can I not find the reason for his change in myself? If I'm wrong, please reassure me. I promise no one will ever find out about our conversation. Okay, the housekeeper gave up. Max was already married. They split up about 7 years ago, and I swear to you on everything I have, if I had the chance, I would definitely talk you out of this wedding. Rose is Max's first wife. She barely escaped from that house. He beat her so badly. You wouldn't dream of it. What's happening to you is a little more than that. But with Rose, it started out small, and then Max got more and more violent. He also cheated on her, disappeared, even though he seemed perfect at the beginning of the relationship. And what did he do to this woman? Why did she have to run away? Ellie asked, her chest tightening with fear or sympathy for a woman she didn't know. He stabbed her because he thought she was flirting with the driver, Mary said. But no such thing happened. Rose simply thanked the man for his help. The driver quit, of course. And Rose simply escaped through the bathroom window. The guard didn't even bother to tell her she was running away. We saw the whole thing on the cameras. It was a real display of cruelty. Ellie got creepy. She asked Mary if maybe she should run away right now instead of waiting for Max to come at her with a knife or other weapon. If you have a place to go, that's exactly what I would advise you to do, the housekeeper replied seriously. That's the problem. I have nowhere to go, Ellie replied sadly. But you might get lucky. He hasn't even touched you yet, just scared you, Mary reasoned. I shouldn't have told you all this. It's up to you. But one thing you can be 100% sure of is that you're not to blame for Max's change. He's always been like that. Ellie thought for a moment. She really had nowhere to go. But she couldn't quite believe the housekeeper's words either. Yes, Max wasn't the perfect husband. But she didn't see him as violent. He took a couple swings. One time he slapped her on the cheek. But all of those times, it was as if it was for business. Ellie had never dealt with a domestic tyrant. She didn't know that all the victims had that kind of thinking. She was trying to protect Max, find an explanation for his actions. She should have run. If a man starts getting handsy, it wouldn't do any good. Ellie gave up and couldn't wait for her husband any longer. She took a shower and went to bed. Just as she was about to close her eyes, she heard the sound of the alarm on the gate. Max had arrived. A few minutes later, Max was already lying next to her, hugging her and talking about love. Why did you wait for me? I told you I would be at the negotiations late, he whispered softly. I couldn't sleep without you. Ellie answered him. She was trembling inside. She was a little afraid of her husband, but he was gentle. Such a man seemed incapable of doing any harm. The woman convinced herself that it was better to live with a millionaire who disappeared and sometimes went to the left at work, than to rot in the village with a penniless loser like Steve. Ellie decided to be more attentive to his behavior, though. As soon as she noticed that her spouse's aggression was out of line, she would pack her things and get away. Ellie lasted quite a while. 2 more years was enough for her. But it's worth noting that Max didn't always go on a bender. He could sometimes come home very drunk. And if the wife kept quiet, everything ended quietly. But sometimes Ellie couldn't stand such insolence and got hit on the lips, or on the cheek, or in the eye. Every time after such provocations, Max made expensive gifts to his wife, and for a few weeks, sometimes months, he was just an ideal spouse. That's why Ellie stopped thinking about divorce. She was used to living on such emotional swings. Every time Max swore that it was the last time he'd let his hands loose, when the collars of his shirt were stained with someone else's lipstick, and Ellie believed him absolutely always. Mary, who was watching from the sidelines, could only look away sadly and sigh sympathetically. She knew it was hard to get out of a relationship like this, especially if your husband was a millionaire and smoothed out every problem with a new ring or a trip. It was the day of Max and Ellie's 3rd anniversary of marriage. The man prepared a dinner for his wife in a fancy restaurant, and his gift was no less chic. Only Ellie at first did not realize what exactly he decided to give her. Max put a folder with documents in front of her and a pen next to it. What's this? Ellie asked, smiling awkwardly. You're giving me a divorce. The woman was a little embarrassed by Max's overly serious look, As soon as he took out the documents, he had abruptly changed from a romantic and loving spouse to a serious businessman. "I want to sign over a construction firm to you," he replied. Ellie didn't understand the point of this gift. She asked him directly why she wanted a business she didn't understand. "I don't want to seem primitive, but wouldn't it be more logical to give me a beauty salon or a clothing store?" "Something more feminine?" Ellie asked gently. Was she afraid of sounding mercurial or disgruntled? She was 100% sure Max was pissed off at her reaction, but it was a very odd choice he'd made. "If I had something like that, I would undoubtedly give you a beauty salon or clothes as a gift," Max replied, not at all angry. "But this is one of my most successful business projects. I just want you to realize that my attitude towards you is the most serious. If anything happens, you'll always have the money. You can consider yourself an independent woman now. All profits from this venture will be deposited into your account. I'll ask you again, are you preparing me for a divorce?" Ellie didn't understand. Max smiled sweetly and repeated that he was not thinking about any divorce. "You know, every millionaire has that moment when he realizes he can trust his spouse," he explained. "It's a gift. It's a gesture of trust. You don't even have to go into any of the processes. Everything will work without you. And then you can start your own business for your soul." Ellie was still considering whether or not to sign. It all seemed a little weird. But then she got a text message on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. It was a one-word opt-in. It's not like the message convinced her. It just made her even more tense. But in the end, she signed. Max clapped his hands happily and asked the waiter to bring the most expensive champagne to celebrate. Ellie indicated that she needed to step away. She almost ran to the ladies' room and tried calling the number from which the message had been sent to her. Almost immediately, the phone was picked up. It was a woman. She didn't say hello, didn't introduce herself, just gave the address and time of the meeting. Ellie stopped thinking at all, but she knew exactly what she was going to do tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Luckily, Max had left before Ellie had to go out. She quickly got ready and hailed a cab. She met at an unremarkable cafe, quite nice, but not exactly expensive. "Ellie," shouted the stranger at the farthest table. The woman raised her hand to indicate that she was the one calling and waiting for her. The voice was similar to the one Ellie had heard on the tube. Ellie took a seat at the table and looked closely at the one that had called her to meet her. For some reason, she felt like she already knew who was in front of her. The woman had a huge scar almost covering her entire face. She hid her hands, but Ellie could see the scars on them as well. "You're Rose, aren't you?" Ellie asked. "I see Mary has already talked to you." Rose smiled back. "You're quite right, I am. But how did you know my number and the gift from Max?" "I fell into some kind of gray scheme." Ellie had a lot of questions. She wanted an answer to at least one of them. Rose confirmed that Ellie was involved in a shady story, but she had a very good chance of turning it around. "Max decided to sign over one of his business projects to you for a reason," Rose began to say. "He thinks he's in trouble with this construction firm and he wants to set you up. He wants you to go to jail, and soon." Ellie didn't understand anything yet. Why Max had decided to set her up, if the situation was such, couldn't he have chosen one of his subordinates? It seemed to her that the ex-wife simply decided to get rid of her rival. Maybe she wanted Max back. Ellie told her thoughts directly to Rose, to which she only laughed in response. "Look at these scars. Who do you think gave them to me?" she asked. "My plan was aimed solely at Max. I didn't know who he was going to turn this firm over to. I'm just lucky that I can kill two birds with one stone to avenge my ex-husband and save you from his tyranny. Plus, you get to keep the lucrative business that Max willingly signed over to you. What's my profit if there's some kind of setup?" Ellie didn't understand. Rose explained that she wasn't the only one involved in the scheme. Max had hurt a lot of people, most of them powerful. Their plan was that Max had been misled. A setup is waiting for him on another project, and the construction firm is clean. They set it up on purpose so he wouldn't notice the big setup over the little one. He's being briefed by our man. While Max clears the tracks and deals with his machinations, he does not know that the setup awaits from the other side. There's already a case against him, Rose explained. "And who are these people who are helping you?" Ellie didn't believe the woman. Who could he hurt so badly? "For example, my husband, who used to be his best friend and did time in prison for him. Because it was Max who framed him, Rose answered. The same way he's trying to frame you now. Look, I completely understand how Max can pour water in your ears. I've put up with all his abuse for a very long time myself. Look at me. He's permanently disfigured my face and my body. It's waiting for you if you keep looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. You can count on my help, Ellie said after much thought. Don't worry, you won't be required to do anything at all. Rose smiled and answered her. Wait a week and you can breathe easy. We'll do it all ourselves. Ellie went home. All the way home she thought about what was next for her. What would happen if Max knew about the setup? If he found out she'd been hanging out with his ex-wife? Why couldn't she stay in her village? She had to get into these games. Max was waiting for her at home. Like a guard dog, he sat by the door, waiting for Ellie. She was more than a little startled when she saw him, especially that piercing gaze that stared straight into her soul. Where have you been? Calmly, making his voice sound even creepier, he asked. I met a classmate. I found her on social media. Ellie lied. Her brain was surprisingly generating the text itself. We haven't seen each other in years, even though we used to be best friends. I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to see her, to show her off. The man didn't know whether to believe Ellie's words or not. He was going through a hard time, so he couldn't trust anyone. But how could he be deceived by a hillbilly? Ellie was too stupid, in his opinion, to lie. Here, too, the man's inflated self-esteem played into Ellie's hands. He couldn't even think that his wife could fool him. I see, Max said and got up from his seat. He believed his wife. But don't go out of the house again. I forbid you to go anywhere without me. She was dumbfounded by such a condition. It seems that the man suspected something or just didn't want to risk it, or he's completely out of his mind. His true tyrant face was showing. Ellie agreed. She had nowhere to go anyway. But Max didn't listen to her. He'd already gone to his office. He didn't need his wife's consent. She wasn't supposed to have a choice or a vote. Max was simply drowning in his permissiveness. How power corrupted him. Ellie didn't understand when that sweet, friendly man had managed to turn into a monster. She couldn't think of another definition for him. The mere sight of him terrified her. When she imagined the man's abuse of Rose, it sent shivers down her spine. It could have happened to her. She'd been fooling herself into thinking it wouldn't affect her. Max was already unraveling. It's a known fact that everything starts small. Mary approached Ellie. She whispered quietly in her ear that there was nothing to worry about. Rose and Ethan had already started their business. Mary's voice trembled. She was afraid Max would hear her words too. Then the whole plan would be over. It was simply impossible. But such was the intense fear this man inspired in them. 2 or 3 days and Max would be arrested, the housekeeper said. Rose told me to tell you not to be afraid. When the case is done, you will be informed. That reassured Ellie a little. She could only hope that in these 2-3 days Max hadn't figured out this plan of his ex-wife and friend. Ellie went to the bedroom to get some privacy to read a book. But she couldn't concentrate on the text. Too many thoughts were in her head. And for the first time since the divorce, she was also thinking seriously about Steve. How he was in the country. Had he found a new woman? Built a new farm? Maybe he's just drunk and died a long time ago. She doesn't even know. Ellie decided that if the case with Max was successful, she would definitely go to the village to visit her ex-husband. Maybe he will even calm down the news that with her lover, Ellie could not build happiness. For some reason, she wanted to make Steve happy. She thought he was even more unhappy than she was. Where did I go? Suddenly, Allie's mind was racing. She's a real farm girl. I'll be fooled here and there. I'll be left with nothing. Oh, this is my punishment for Steve. What a shame I did to him, abandoning him in his hour of need. For 3 days, Allie was on pins and needles. She couldn't even relax when Max left for work. She kept glancing at her phone or out the window, waiting for her husband to come running and tell her that he was aware of all the setups that were being set up for him. Max became even more irritable. But there was a positive change in him. He no longer smelled of women's perfume and his shirt wasn't expressed with someone else's lipstick. But Ellie wasn't happy about that anymore. It is understandable that in such a situation a man does not care about cheating. He stopped paying attention to her too, but became very irritable. On the third day, Ellie waited for the call. The phone was lying screen down, and she didn't know who was calling. If it was Max, she'd better run right away. If Rose, then it was over and she could exhale. Ellie remembered all the prayers she knew, asking God to help her. But before she died, she couldn't breathe. You couldn't miss a call, no matter who it came from. Rose's number popped up on the screen. Ellie had it listed as Claire, a classmate. Allie didn't even realize what kind of school friend was calling her. "Max is being taken to the station," Rose said, and then shouted loudly with joy. "It's done. Our driver's coming to pick you up now. Come out with your things in 20 minutes. Ellie hung up the phone and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw a frightened woman. What had happened to her? When had she gotten so weak? After all, she used to be a real thunderstorm. Steve was afraid to say a word to her. Now she's like a hunted mouse, running away from a sinking ship again. Only now she's got the gold with her. Even on this occasion she was worried, even though Max had signed the company over to her. Interesting, she thought. Would he feel guilty for realizing that he had imprisoned an innocent woman whom he had once sworn to love? Hardly. This man seemed to lack the quality of conscience altogether. Why did this happen to him? Money. That's just the way he is. Ellie couldn't answer that question, but such reasoning distracted her from her worries. Ellie didn't even think about what things she should take with her. Obviously, she wouldn't carry her entire closet. And should she do it at all? The woman threw everything she could think of into her suitcase. There was only one thought in her head. She had to run away quickly. What if Max comes back? We've got to get out of here. Ellie was also afraid to get into a car with a stranger. But now she had nothing to lose. She was tired of being afraid of everything. If she was going to die at the hands of the mafia, so be it. The driver brought Ellie to a beautiful mansion a little smaller than Max's, but no worse. Rose and a man met her at the gate. Ellie recognized him immediately. He was the man who wanted to buy out Steve's farm. Is that why Max didn't confront him? Because that's his best friend he set up. How many other people has her husband caused pain and suffering to? How many of his friends and family had experienced a stab in the back? Ellie also didn't understand how Max had managed to disguise himself so skillfully as a decent and sympathetic man. After all, that was the impression she had gotten of him after meeting him. She thought he was perfect. "You burned down my husband's farm," Ellie said without anger. She rather wanted to make it clear that she was not mistaken. The man was a little offended by this assumption. Unlike his old friend, he always played fair and never went for the head. Yes, he had given Steve a scare then, but it had been nothing more than a bluff. Ethan would never take people's property from them, would never go head to head. Even Max's revenge had originally been Rose's idea. Her mental wounds were too deep. Not true. Ethan calmly answered her. It was the old wiring that burned her. Ellie waved her hand. That was a matter of bygone days. Now she was more interested in her own fate. But the woman was only interested in how Rose and Ethan had come together. Grief had brought them together, Rose replied. While I was married to Max, there was nothing between us. But Ethan was the only one around him who stood up for me. The others saw Max as the perfect man. Or they were afraid to say anything against him. We got married after I got out of prison, Ethan complimented his wife's answer. I found Rose on my own. How worried I was about her, and how happy I was when I learned that she had escaped from that tyrant. Now I'm just as happy for you. The woman spent one night at Ethan and Rose's house, and the next day she rented an apartment to make sure Max was out of her life. Ellie decided to drive up to the house to see how things were going now. The cottage was indeed sealed up, and none of the servants were there. She was only interested in the fate of one person, Mary. Her number had not been removed. She knew Rose had kept in touch with her. Ellie headed toward Max's ex-wife. What was her surprise when the door was opened to her by Mary? The women hugged each other tightly. Are you here now? Ellie asked her. Yes, my life has changed for the better too, the housekeeper answered her. By the way, it's very good of you to come. Rose wanted to talk to you. Rose warned that Ellie would soon be called in for questioning. She told her to only tell the coroner what Ellie needed to know. The construction company Max had given her for her anniversary. That was it. There was no more information she had or could have. Ellie did, but no one suspected her of anything. There was no basis for it. None of this was a dream. Ellie hadn't been tricked by anyone. And Max did go to prison, and for many years. He never found out that his wife knew about the setup. Ellie divorced him. Max didn't even argue about it. He understood perfectly well that the woman did not have to wait for him for so long. He would be released as an old man. Rose and Ethan helped Ellie with the business. In one thing, Max was not lying. Everything in the firm was really already automated. Ellie was just the owner and made a profit. She didn't need to know anything else. It was about 6 months after the whole story. Ellie had already established a stable life. She'd bought a house. Rose had become her best friend, and the woman had decided to put to rest the last issue that had been holding her back. She wanted to talk to Steve. On the way to the village, Ellie thought about how she would start the conversation. Where should she even start with apologies, with confessions, with questions? But soon she realized that there was no way to prepare for this conversation. Let it go as it came. No memorized text, prepared phrase will not sound more sincere. Therefore, it is not worth it to go over the words in her head. She will say from the heart. Here we see a familiar house. Nothing has changed here. It was the same as the day she left. Ellie was pleased to see that the yard and the house itself looked well maintained. That meant Steve was alive and not drunk. Otherwise, things would have looked very different. Just as Ellie was getting ready to get out of the car, a woman appeared at the gate. Ellie stopped and slammed the door shut. There was a lump in her throat. The woman was a real beauty. She hadn't seen one like her in the village before. It appeared that Steve had built his happiness and found a new wife without her. But a second later, something happened that finally killed Ellie. A little boy ran out after the stranger. He looked no more than 2 years old. He shouted "Mommy," and smiled cheerfully. Ellie wiped away the tears that suddenly rolled down her cheeks. "I'm happy for you, Steve," she said. "You did the right thing." Ellie started the car and turned back into town. She decided it was not worth it to pry into her ex-husband's new family. He had learned to live without her, so she would be able to make the young mom nervous. Up until this point, Ellie was sure her ex-husband had gone cold. But why did it hurt so much that she couldn't breathe? Why those traitorous tears would not stop flowing from her eyes? No matter how Ellie tried to calm herself down, it was useless. The pain was frozen in her heart, but she would try to eradicate it. Adjusting to her new life wasn't easy for Ellie. Sometimes she'd wake up at night with horrible dreams of Max coming at her with a knife and leaving the same scars on her face and body as Rose. It's amazing how patient women can be. Maybe it's impatience and strength? And stupidity? Would Ellie have been able to save herself from a husband like Max? If it weren't for Rose and Ethan? Absolutely not. At best, he'd have thrown her out on the street, leaving her with nothing. Or he'd really set her up and send her to prison. Ellie used to be strong. She could and did solve her own problems. That's why she had nightmares. Because she lost herself in that marriage. What did she want when she left Steve? Certainly not this outcome. And life worked itself out. Steve got a decent wife and child, and Ellie got loneliness. Yes, she was rich, independent, but none of it made sense without love. The woman was lonely, and no amount of wealth could fill that void in her chest. It had been 5 years since Ellie had moved to the city. Had she thought then how her divorce from Steve would end? Ellie certainly didn't think that one day she would be going to a business meeting for her case. Nor did Ellie imagine that she would become a successful businesswoman who owns not only a construction company, but also a chain of beauty salons. But for all that, she would remain single. She has wonderful loyal friends in the person of Rose and Ethan, a lot of acquaintances, and the most influential and rich in the city. But will not be the main simple female happiness family and a loved one near. To somehow compensate for her loneliness, Ellie got herself a cute dog breed corgi. This four-legged friend became her outlet. She would tell him how her day was going and what her plans were for tomorrow. With him, she shared her most frank feelings. That day she had a meeting with a new supplier of salon materials. She had scheduled it at her favorite restaurant, which served the best risotto in town. Ellie was a woman of punctuality, but this time she arrived a half hour early. She decided to stay in the car to finish a chapter of the audiobook. She preferred listening to something like that instead of music on the road. Ellie enjoyed the narrator's voice and looked around. Her interest in the passers-by had not diminished, even though she was rich now. And driving an expensive car, she still looked at the city as a woman coming from the village. Everything was interesting and curious to her. Suddenly a car parked right in front of her. She wouldn't have noticed it, but it was exactly the same. Although Ellie had specifically ordered a certain paint color, matched the rims, this car had everything exactly the same. Ellie even went out to see who her tastes were so much in line with. The woman expected to see anyone but him. Her ex-husband Steve stepped out of the car. The man noticed Ellie too and smiled broadly. "Hello," he said, and approached Ellie with open arms. "How long I've waited to meet you." Surprisingly, Ellie responded to his greeting and hug. "Why did you dream of meeting me? Aren't your new wife and son giving you trouble?" Steve looked at his ex-wife as if she were insane. He informed her that he didn't have a child wife. "What do you mean?" "Well, then who did I see outside your house? Or rather, our house?" Ellie was genuinely surprised. If the woman had lingered outside her old house for just a few minutes that time 2 years ago, she would have seen that a completely different man had followed the boy out. Not Steve. Then she might have known much sooner what had happened to her husband. Would have found him sooner and talked to him. But she'd decided Steve had a new family and didn't want to ruin their idyll. All she had to do was look in the rearview mirror to see the stranger. But she decided to let bygones be bygones. "This story is going to take quite a while," Steve answered her. "I understand you have a meeting. I can suggest we go to dinner and talk things over. I'll cancel my negotiations right away." "Unless you're busy," Ellie immediately responded. "I can't work tonight and wait for tonight. My curiosity is already eating me up." "That's fine. I was just going to have lunch." "Let me buy you a drink then," Steve said politely, and gave his ex-wife a hand. While the man was ordering, Ellie called her partner and rescheduled the meeting for the next day. No one was against it. "I'm listening attentively," Ellie said, and cupped her chin with her hands like the most interested student in class. "Let me start by saying that almost an hour after you left with your lover, I had visitors," Steve began. "I even pulled out my shotgun when I saw it was the man I thought had set fire to my farm. I was in such a state I might have actually shot him. You just destroyed me morally." Ellie cast a guilty look downward. She hadn't thought about Steve's feelings at the time. She had dreamed of a beautiful life, a rich lover, and expensive gifts. It was much later that she thought about the pain she had caused her ex-spouse. "This man tried for a long time to make me believe that he didn't set fire to anything," Steve went on to say. "I did not believe a word of it. I did not understand only why he came, if he had already done his dirty work. To be honest, I don't remember what words the man found to convince me of his innocence. But what I do remember is how he took out a suitcase and handed it to me. It was filled to the top with bills. This stranger told me that he was still willing to buy the property even after the fire. He gave me even more than he had planned to offer, added a little as moral compensation. And I agreed." Ellie smiled. She knew who Steve was talking about. That man was Ethan, who was now her good friend. The woman decided that it was absolutely necessary to introduce her ex-husband to Ethan, if they continued to communicate with Steve, of course. "When I received the divorce notice, I was already starting a new business," Steve continued. "I decided that this time I would start a fishing business. We had a salmon farm in the village, but it was abandoned. I bought it and restored it." "How much money did that businessman give you?" Ellie was surprised. "Enough to realize my dream," Steve added modestly. "And then I realized that the village was no longer enough for me. The business was growing, and there were more and more customers. Good fish is hard to find in our region, so I did not miss when I chose this direction. I sold the house, moved to the city, but not quite. I live outside the city, in a luxury village. It turns out that close to civilization, and staying close to nature. So this is who I saw in the house? The family that bought that house from you?" Ellie guessed. Steve noted that he was pleasantly surprised by the fact that Ellie had come to visit him. He thought she didn't even want to remember him. Then it was Allie's turn to share her story of her marriage to Max. She noticed that her ex-husband clenched his fists, holding back tears as he listened about how Max had abused her. He was uncomfortable, and Ellie figured Steve still had feelings. "I never forgot about you." Softly, barely audible, Steve said. Everything I've accomplished is because of you. I wanted so much to prove to you that I wasn't a loser, that I was worth something. That's why I'm grateful to you to the end of my life." Ellie couldn't hold back the tears. She had broken not only herself but Steve as well. They both came out of this story different people. The one thing they had in common was that they were loners. That's because they were made for each other. It was impossible for them to find happiness in someone else. Apparently, it was worth it to go through such a difficult breakup and go through this difficult path to realize such a simple truth. After this conversation, it became obvious to both of them that they could not live without each other. But they were both embarrassed to admit it. All because Ellie thought Steve was indifferent to her, and Steve thought Ellie didn't need him. Once again, the insecurities of the ex-spouses are back. But someone had to step up. Someone was destined to right this wrong. Since Ellie still felt more responsible for their breakup, she suggested they meet again. Steve was only too happy to agree. Then they had another meeting and another. After a month of such regular meetings, former spouses decided that there is no point in hiding the obvious: they love each other, and life separately cannot imagine. It rarely happens. But sometimes exes get together and something good comes out of it. Ellie and Steve were able to put old grudges behind them, put the past behind them. They started with a clean slate and built a strong family. But the main gift of fate for them was Mike, about whom Ellie and Steve dreamed since the day of their first wedding. The best friends of the couple became Rose and Ethan, who had a daughter born just a month later than Mike. The young parents dreamed that one day their children would grow up and fall in love, but if that happens, it's not soon enough. For now, the two business ladies had to learn their new role as mothers. Fortunately, both had wonderful husbands they could rely on. The birth of their children only further strengthened their friendship.